Hello, and welcome back to another Village Torah with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. We are now in Parashat Toledot, or Toldos, if you prefer an Ashkenazi pronunciation. So Toldos, that is, we're still very much in the book of Genesis and Sefer Bereshit. I actually wanted to take a moment, and really focus on this word. So Toldos, it's one of the first words in this week's Torah portion, Toledos. Now the word means generations or offspring, and the root is basically yeled, right? Of holid, of people having children. So what we see is that it talks about offspring, children, and all of that. Now, this week's Torah portion does feature the outset this word, Toledot, and it's not the only time this word is used. In fact, it's not even the first time it's used. It's used, a bunch of other times, more than a half dozen times previous to this, just in the book of Genesis alone. Now, this word, if we want to take a really far expansive look at it, appears 39 times within the entirety of the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible. And of these 39, a full third of these, 13, appear in the book of Genesis. It turns out another third of this word in certain permutations occurs another 13 times in the book of Numbers alone, and we have still yet another 13 appearances sprinkled throughout the books of Exodus, Chronicles, and Ruth. So this does appear 39 times. However, I will say that even though this word and its various, if you will, offspring appear 39 times throughout the entirety of the Bible, only a third of them, 13 of these appearances throughout the entirety of the Bible are specifically this word Toledot. Many of the sort of related words are Toledot Tam, which are their offspring or sort of their generations. But the specific Toledot or Toldos, generations, is used 13 times. Now, of these, 11 of them are found within the book of Genesis, including what we have at the outset of our parasha. The other 2 times, in case you are curious, occur towards the beginning of the book of Numbers in chapter 3 in the first verse. And the other time is in Ruth, the 4th chapter of Ruth in the 18th verse, where it talks about Todos Paretz. So Peretz's offspring, his generations, and what we find in the beginning of the book of Numbers, I mentioned the first verse in the 3rd chapter, is total Aharon and Moshe, so Aaron and Moshe's children. But the majority of these 13 appearances of just the phrase Toledot in the entirety of the Tanakh and the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, 11 of these are all found within the book of Genesis. Now, of these, I mentioned, you know what, let's just run through them. Let's just go through all 11 of them to better understand this word. So the first one is actually found in the 2nd chapter, the 4th verse, Ela Toledot Hashamayim Va'aretz. These are sort of literally like the generations, the offspring. This is what happens with the heavens and the earth. And we see that, which is interesting. It's not a person. It's just the heaven and the earth and their offspring. We then encounter the very first verse in the 5th chapter of Genesis again, Zeh Sefer Toledot Adam. This is the book of the generations of Adam, man. Okay? Now, and then what we see for really the rest of the book of Genesis, it goes through other key figures in the book of Genesis. So in chapter 6, verse 9, Ela Toledot Noach. These are the generations of Noah. In the first verse in chapter 10, Ela Toledot B'nai Noach. These are the generations of the children of Noach. And that's an interesting twist, right? We do have, again, Ela Toledot, and I will mention that all subsequent uses of this, so that means 9. So 9 of these 11 appearances of the term Toledot in the book of Genesis are all within this phrase, Ela Toledot, and then someone's name. So these are the generations of so-and-so, right? So we have, I just mentioned in the 6th chapter, Ela Toledot Noach. This is the offspring of Noach. 10th chapter, verse 1, Ela Toledot B'nai Noach, the children of Noach. And then we get a bunch of other biblical figures. We get 2 appearances in the 11th chapter. In the 10th verse, we get Shem. So that's one of Noah's children. In the verse 27 in the 11th chapter, we get Terach. That's an interesting one. He's not a famous figure, really. He is Avram's father, so that is not insignificant for sure. We then get two in the 25th chapter. We get in verse 12 Yishmael, so Ishmael. We get what we have in the very first verse of this week's Torah portion, which we have verse 19 in the 25th chapter, Ela Toledot Yitzchak. So this is Isaac's, right? And then we still have three more, actually. We get two in the 36th chapter. In both verses 1 and 9, we have Esav, which is kind of funny. We have it at the very first verse in the 36th chapter, Ela Toledot Esav. These are the generations of Esav. Eight verses later, we get it again. And then to close out the book of Genesis, we have Ela Toledot Yaakov in the second verse in the 37th chapter. Now, what's actually kind of funny when we think about it, one person we would have expected to see on there is none other than Avram or Avraham, right? Avraham. He's a very significant figure in the book of Genesis, very important. And yet we don't see him at all. And in fact, when we look at who these various characters are, although setting aside what we see in that second chapter, Ela Toledot Hashemayim Va'aretz, right? These are the heavens and the earth's generations. They're all people, right? They're all people. And they're significant. We start off, of course, we get Zet Sefer Toledot Adam. This is the book of the generations of man. So Adam. We get Noah. We even get the sons of Noah, and subsequently, I can't say that word. Subsequently, we get Shem, which is one of the children of Noah, which seems a little bit redundant. I'll admit that. And then, of course, we get Terach, who's perhaps the least significant character on this list that I've just enumerated and listed off for us, which is a little bit strange. I mean, it's really strange because he is not a significant character at all. The most significant, the highest significance we could attribute to him is that he is Avram's father. And shockingly, Avraham does not get this. He does not appear in this phrase, or at least not explicitly, which I'll get to in a moment. We do have Ishmael. We do have Isaac in the beginning of this week's Torah portion. Curiously, we get a double mention of Esav in that 36th chapter, and we finish off with Jacob, with Yaakov. Now, what I think is happening. Okay, so I really don't know about the Esav. Why does Esau get double mention of this? That I'm not sure about. But from a cursory read, it seems that even that we sort of begin those first handful of chapters in the book of Genesis with talking about sort of the setup, the sort of the infrastructure, as it were, the physical, material world. That's why Ela Toledot Hashemayim Va'aretz. That we have to figure out what's out there. Where do people exist? And really what structures the rest of the book of Genesis is really the background, if we think about it. Yes, to people in general, but I think it's sort of the backstory for the children of Israel, for our ancestors, Bnei Yisrael, right, the Israelites. And that's why the final in this list, the final person listed is Yaakov, is Jacob, because Jacob ultimately gets his name changed from Jacob to Israel, and that sets up all the different tribes of which we are the descendants. So that's a really fascinating piece. It starts, if we want to take away Hashemayim Va'aretz, but we think about the people, starts with Adam and ultimately ends with Jacob. And I think it's also telling, even though most of these are in the phrasing of Ela Toledot so-and-so, these are the generations of so-and-so, it starts off by saying Zes Sefer, right? This is the book of the generations of man, and basically it finishes off with Jacob. Right, if we want to think about that. That's all what this is doing, this is sort of the background of humanity, setting up what's to come as we get more particularistic, setting us up in the book of Exodus. Now, going back to what I mentioned earlier, we do have Terach, which is strange. Why is Terach mentioned? He's not significant. He's not a significant character for our people, for Bnei Yisrael, for the Torah. No one says, oh, Terach was so important. He's not, but he is Avram's father. Which points out, I think it really highlights, this is very strange. Abraham's very important to us. Why doesn't he have something mentioned in here? Well, actually, what we see is going back to the end of last week's Torah portion. In fact, I mentioned that what this week's Torah portion starts off with is the 19th verse of the 25th chapter. If we go back to the just 7 verses earlier, the 12th verse, we have Toledot Yishmael. Okay, so we have Yishmael's, but then we go into Isaac's. But what's really fascinating is it mentions both for Ishmael and for Isaac that they are the sons of Abraham. Interesting. And moreover, it's not just that they're the children of Abraham, they're the sons of Abraham, but we also see this is only the very beginning of the first verse, right, of this week's Torah portion. Ele todos Yitzchak ben Avram. These are the generations of Isaac, the son of Abraham. But then it says Avram holid as Yitzchak, that Abraham birthed his son Isaac. So maybe it's not really going into, who knows? I mean, we can speculate, but what I would imagine, my speculation here, is that Abraham's really fascinating, because what we saw in last week's Torah portion is Abraham had, even though he married Sarah and had, first of all, he had Yishmael with Hagar, he had Isaac with Sarah, but then after Sarah's death, he then had a whole bunch more children. So I think it's really trying to limit us. We're not trying to look at all of Abraham's children. We're really just looking at, we're going to be certainly the book of Genesis is primarily looking at these 2 children and their offspring. So it seems that Abraham is very significant, and I think his absence as part of this phrase is all the more highlighted by this, especially since his father gets mentioned. Both of these 2 significant sons that get mentioned, and yet he is omitted. But I think that I think it kind of ironically even highlights Abraham's significance within the book of Genesis and the Torah more broadly. So that's what I've got. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and any speculation you might have. So I hope that sheds some light on what this week's Torah portion is, Toledot, and sort of that name, and more as we see that phrase more broadly used throughout the book of Genesis. And I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. And before we close out, I also want to express my gratitude for the Jewish Home of Cincinnati, because all Jewish life programs, all Jewish everything going on here at Cedar Village is thank you so much to the Jewish Home of Cincinnati for providing the financial support for making all this happen. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for watching, and Shabbat Shalom.